Okay, what I wanted to do in this vidcast is go over at least hopefully get through kinship. Some of this we've already seen before, so it won't be entirely new, but it's some sort of repetitious, but it's important. Um, the key concept in Japan is you have to entirely separate it from the Chinese or the Korean. Totally different society. I think again, one of the stereotypes when you talk about Asian is sort of an assumption of similarity. But when you think about it, I don't think when people talk about maybe European, they think of the Spanish and the Germans as being the same thing. So I'm not sure what that's about. I think it's just ethnocentrism. The key part in Japanese logic of social relationships is the EA, and this is the household. So this means, as I mentioned before, when I was showing you the pictures of that old reconstructed village, that this is folks live under the same roof. So it's not the Chinese system or even the Korean system where it's the lineage. So if you would, your kinship tree isn't important is as important as your address. Um, Now, if you remember when I was talking about the 47 Ronin in that other presentation, you actually then have loyalty. So you have the social traditionally had social hierarchy. So you have folk that are more important, less important. And in modern Japanese society, still to say it's largely more socioeconomic, but you still have the idea of more important, less important. But what that means, though, is where those folks reside and how they've interacted historically is more important than their family tree. And so what happens is folks that aren't your relatives genealogically, but live in the same place will basically take on, to the Chinese or Koreans, they become like junior sort of, kin members. And it's, yeah, and it's what happens is that becomes at least as important, in fact, in some cases more important than actual kinship if there's distance involved. And so what you find is in Japanese society, and I'm not sure how far this goes back. I would have a sneaking suspicion if someone took a closer look at the Chinese accounts of the Japanese society back in like 300 AD and stuff like that, they find that was already in place there. This strikes me as being a very traditional Japanese logic, and it's a very durable logic because you still see it today. Let me show you some images here. So part of it puts into the visual context. This is a little town on the way to Takayama. And what you would find is the folks that live in this neighborhood, the image you see in front of you, would spend more time interacting, would have more sense of obligation, if you would, to each other than they might to distant relatives, say cousins who live in I don't know, in Nagoya or something like that. And so that becomes your key structured logic is the close relationship of places. Now, in part, that might also explain why you don't see family compounds in Japan. You don't see the equivalent of what you see in Korea or China, which you're going to find basically fenced off or walled off areas, and then inside of that is the whole extended family, i.e., the immediate clan. In Japan, you tended to have a little bit of that, with your traditional social elite, i.e., the samurai. But I'm not even sure how much of that was actually the case and how much of that was just enforced by the, whoever the shogun was. Um, but what you find is the network of social relationships is based on proximity. Um, Whoops, sorry about that. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's proximity in an urban setting or a rural setting. The rural setting is more easy to sort of visualize because you're actually separated by space. So this neighborhood in Kyoto, right near the Imperial Park, would be a good example. The folks in these separate houses aren't related to each other, but I can almost guarantee, since it seems like a pretty traditional neighborhood, that they not only know each other, but there's a sense of over time, and many of them probably lived. For example, this is a relative pretty new building, but I have a sneaking suspicion you'd find the family that lives in that probably had an earlier structure that they've then renovated and rebuilt into this one. So what you're going to find is folks have lived at the same address for considerable, especially in Kyoto and places like that, a considerable amount of time, generations. And the relationship they have with their neighbors is a generational relationship. So it'd be in many ways would be the equivalent of a clan or something like that in the Chinese system. Again, a very typical Japanese neighborhood. This is one of the Nishichaya. I can't remember exactly where that is in Kyoto. I think it's to the west. Um, but this is a typical, contemporary Japanese neighborhood. And these folks, both on either sides of the street, and especially next to each other on the same side of the street, are going to be part of neighborhood associations. They're going to do things as groups. If this particular area has a matsuri or somehow has a festival, they all do stuff collectively as a group. They probably don't work at the same places. So the interesting thing about this is that, it's not like they have the same job. It's not like a workers' compound would be in, say, the United States in an old coal mining area. But what you are going to find is all these folks went to school together. And so they've, the kids played together, they've known each other since they were little kids. I should point out that one of the side aspects of this that's really sort of interesting is when you look at Japanese addresses, Japanese addresses are based on the intersections of streets. And then, the houses are numbered relative to the corner of the street. So if this guy's doing he's doing a delivery, you have to intimately know the neighborhood to know who you're delivering stuff to. There's none of this like there is in the United States of a name and then a street address that you can use to, Google Maps to then locate that house. Don't have that. It's an entirely different system. The neighborhood has an address, but individual houses are just sort of like the third house from the corner of the street. So it's a very different sort of mindset in terms of the role of neighbors. Neighbors are much more important. You have to pick up your stuff. They're going to share, all sorts of things together. This is some kids I bumped into in Takayama at the Hida village. So these kids are all going to school together. They've got the same cute uniforms. They go to the same school. Now, what that means is since these kids are from the same small town, Takayama, and since they go to school together, all through the rest of their adult lives, they're going to network with each other. It's normal in Japanese society for when these kids get into the 30s, 40s, or 50s to every year or a couple of years get together. A lot of folks, especially in areas like Takayama, these kids, when they're in their 50s or 60s, will still get together once a year. They might do trips as a group, even then. So their interaction isn't just, residential. It isn't just going to school together. They're actually expected to bond. And a large part of the Japanese educational system is to get these kids to actually become a group. Whereas in the United States, I think if anything, you'd argue that you'd try to, the educational system's functions to make people effective individuals. And Japanese educational system, right from, pre-kindergarten, it's to make them effective group members. And the member they're a group of is going to be the member of the same school. I would think it must be incredibly terrible for kids to have to move from one school to another if the parents change a job, because the trauma would be absolutely stunning. It'd be basically being disassociated from your family for most of them. So among other things, that means that there's a lot of pressure to stay in a neighborhood. You don't see this as much in some of the urban areas, in places like urban Tokyo, Osaka, and stuff like that, where people work for corporations. They have to move around, but even then, companies have to be pretty careful about moving people. You don't arbitrarily move folks. I know that Walmart, but I was very young and worked for Kmart. They intentionally moved all the management every 3 years, which is one reason why I quit. They didn't want the same management team at the same store, and they would usually move you to another state. I know Walmart still does that. And that's, to me, that's insane. But you can imagine how that would totally not work in a Japanese setting. These kids expect to grow up. By the age these kids are, they expect they're going to have lifelong experiences with each other to the extent that you probably would with, say, brothers and sisters, cousins, and such like that. Even though they're not genealogically related, they are a group, and they're a very tight knit group, and they will stay a tight knit group all the way through the rest of their lives. In many cases, more importantly than their spouses. So, for example, when she gets married, in her 20s or something like that, this group here, her classmates, will be as important or more important to her emotionally and socially than her spouse might be. And that would be expected. This is expected to be people's support group. The parents expect this. The coworkers expect this. This is your go-to group for almost everything in Japanese society. And here you just see an example at a young age of this sort of being developed. That's when Japanese do tons of field trips. They take the kids everywhere. And that's not as much, it's, in part to experience this place, but it's also for them to experience it's experience new settings as a group, and they're building your bonding as a group. Okay, okay, good. So just can't reiterate how important that is. Um, in the structure of Japanese society has an all Asian society, is what we call patrilineal. Now, as again, if you remember, I was talking about Chinese, you have to sort of qualify that. Though Japanese women don't have the same type of ability, if you want to think of it like that, to become almost pseudo male in terms of their role relationships. In Japanese society, it's very difficult for women to be other than women roles. The current prime minister is maybe an exception to the rule. But one of the striking things when you look at Japanese companies versus their Chinese counterparts, I certainly see this in the airline industry, is that Chinese airlines have a number of senior executives who are women, and they're not there as tokens. They're tough ladies, and you screw around with them at your own risk. Their Japanese counterparts are almost always in human relations or something like that. And they're there so the Japanese company can say that they have some women in authority. But I'm pretty sure when they get down to the board meetings, they're not really a critical part of the system. This is a huge problem the Japanese have in terms of corporate and government management, is the total lack of women in senior positions of authority, especially compared to their Chinese counterparts. So Japanese society is much more patrilineal. You trace descent through men. Women move into husbands' families. They're patrilocal. Traditionally in Japanese society, couples move in to live with the husband's parents or the husband's family. And again, you have to remember, all throughout Asia, it's very typical for newly married couples to live with the husband's parents, for the rest of their lives. The idea of setting up your own household of an independent family is very much the sort of American, I would argue, not even Europe, but American stereotype of the quote nuclear family, unquote, and really doesn't have any counterpart in Asia. Moving out of the family, purview, especially if you move away from the family. I suppose if it's based on job, if the husband has a job with, say, Toyota, so he has to go to the Toyota City, headquarters, wherever that is outside of Chiba somewhere, then that's just, that's because of work. But for the couple to move out from his parents just because they want more independence, would the neighbors and everything, among other things, would have a huge amount of sort of gossip about, what's going on with the family that they want to leave. Traditionally in Japanese society, more so than Chinese society, there's this idea of primogeniture. So the oldest son is the one that takes over stuff. Chinese talk a lot about this, but what you usually find is oldest sons are supposed to distribute the family resources and power to the other brothers and sisters and even cousins that they have. And again, this is that really close generational tie that the Chinese have. In Japanese society, since you don't have that same system, remember the image of the kids I just showed you, their relationship is going to be with folks who are the same age, mixed genders, male and female, but they're not part of the same genealogical group. So therefore, the idea of sharing your resources, control, whatever, with your brothers, sisters / cousins is a lot more sort of problematic or situational in Japanese society. So you tend to see a lot more of the senior son of the family is going to control the family resources to a sort of greater extent than their Chinese counterparts. As with the rest of Asian societies, there's this very strong stereotype, maybe even stronger. Well, I wouldn't say it's stronger, it maybe plays out differently in Japanese society, that men are in one charge and at one point are in charge. This is sort of classic, modern sort of reinterpretation of the samurai. The guy in charge and the yukata or in armor or something like that, carrying swords, being in charge and making decisions. The shogun, if you would. In fact, it's sort of the slang is the samurai dad. Is a slang you hear for Japanese guys who sort of take on this idea that, I'm in charge and this is my family and da 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 da. What you almost invariably find is the reality, especially once you come through the front door into the house, is that's the woman's kuleana. She runs the house. And this is to a greater extent than Chinese would be. I mean, it's one of my in-laws actually, even though she's Chinese, she studied for 3 years in Japan to learn Japanese. She was originally a translator for the government. So she spent time with Japanese families, and she was always shocked by the fact that when you went into a household, the husband or the head of the family didn't even know what bank they banked at. He had no idea how much money. In fact, in many cases, he didn't even know what his salary was. His wife handled all that. And traditionally in Japanese society, in fact, even still today, women slash wives handle all financial matters. Husbands don't. If you would, husbands are so busy looking good that they don't really know how to manage anything. Women, on the other hand, let the husbands look good because as long as you let him do his thing, then you can actually run the family. So even as much as, in fact, I'd even argue more so than in Chinese society, the wife is not only she's not only the ruler of the family, she runs all the finances. She's the emotional support for the kids to a much greater extent than the Chinese. Japanese mothers are much closer to their children emotionally and socially. I think because you don't have the clan ties. In Chinese society, you can expect brothers and sisters and cousins and stuff to be that generational emotional block. And so nieces and nephews will hang out together and do stuff together. This is stereotypically Chinese. In Japanese society, you don't have that because you have the idea that folks live under the same roof. You don't have this, you know, family link to other clan members necessarily. So the power or role of the mother is much more emotional central to the power of the family and the stability of the family. So everyone puts up with dad being in charge, but everyone knows that when push comes to shove, you got to talk to mom. And even the husband will know that. There's this classic thing you can see if you ever watch Japanese go to purchase something like a car or a house or whatever, where they'll come in and the husband will go into say a car dealership and say, "Oh, I really want this car." Um, and the salesman will do the whole PR pitch and they take it out for a drive and stuff like that. Immediately then turns to the wife, and that's who that does the negotiations. So mom does the deals. Dad says what he wants, and mom in general will have to indulge him if she possibly can. But everyone knows, both the salesperson, the bank, whoever, even dad to a certain extent is going to know mom's going to call the shots when it comes to how things actually function. So women control everything basically within the front door of the house. Men are visibly in charge outside of the house. And you see this not so much, the current generation is a little different, but it's really striking if you go to more conservative cities like, again, Kyoto or in the countryside. It's not uncommon to still see families where the males of the family walk a step or two instead of the women in front of the women of the family. And that's sort of a Japanese thing. I mean, it was normative till maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but I'd see even folks over their 30s, age wise. You'll still see that pattern. It would never occur for the couple to go out shopping together. I mean, unless it's something he wants, but even then he'll take her along because she pays the bills. Husbands are very frequently still today in Japan given allowances by their wives. They don't know the bank. They don't know the bank accounts. They don't have they have a debit card, but they're separate debit cards. His debit card will have a ceiling limit on it. I think it's like debit cards you can get for kids here. She actually has the access to the accounts. If he went to the bank and tried to withdraw the money, I can guarantee the bank would pause, hold the account, freeze it, and check with the wife in terms of what the hell is going on. It would never occur to the bank that the guy, i.e. a male in the family, would actually have control of all the financial matters. Now, it's a little bit different if it's a company, but even then you'll find that the women who would be executive assistants or the accountants or something would generally be the ones that are handling most of your financial matters. And this also then applies, of course, to other things like, dating, who the kids are going to go out with, how and stuff like that. That's the mother and wife/wife's responsibility. If the kids they get into trouble, bad behavior, that's going to be the wife's fault, not the husband's. Now, one of the problems you get into that Japanese society has not been able to deal with at all And Japanese society really has been very inflexible in terms of handling change. We'll get into this at the very end when we talk about changes in Japanese society. But one of the problems they've had is, of course, with the growth of the move to urban areas. This is, the IKEA phenomenon of abandoned homes in rural areas is a classic example of this. We saw this the last time we went to Lake Biwa outside of Kyoto. You just go through neighborhoods, and it seems like the neighborhood is entirely old folks, especially old women. A few kids, not near as many as you'd see with the Chinese. But then what you see is a bunch of houses, not one, but maybe out of 10 houses, maybe 3 to 5 that there's obviously they're abandoned. And this is due to one moving to urban areas, moving to Kyoto, Osaka, wherever, where Kobe, wherever it might be. But more importantly, is also shifting to nuclear families. As folks move to urban high rises, which is the norm for most of the urban areas now in Japan, that pretty much forces them into nuclear family settings. And if they're working for companies, they're not going to have the same neighborhood logic that you had in those images I showed you. They might be in a high rise, but that high rise isn't going to be terribly different than the one I lived in for about a year and a half in Kakaako. You might know one or two of your neighbors, but everyone's pretty much be strangers because people are moving in and out. And so what happens is, especially given the importance of neighbors as a social network, that completely collapses. The kids don't have the same friends in school for their entire career. The wife who's at home doesn't have the same set of close neighbors that they've known probably for generations, because she undoubtedly, she's from that area. She grew up going to the same schools as her husband, da 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 da. So that all just has disappeared. And you don't have a replacement for it. You don't have the concept of independent families. You don't have the concept of the nuclear family being an emotional structural unit. And so Japanese society has done a real bad job collectively of handling the change from the especially 1950s on, of the move to urban centers. The move is pretty much dominant. I think it's 80% of Japanese live in urban areas now, but they've never come to grips with that socially. And that makes for a real complex set of scenarios, not the least of which is, especially for wives or women in urban areas, they tend to depend in some ways even more on the network of folks they grew up with in terms of schooling. But of course, with the folks that are under age of 50, is their schooling wasn't just at one place. So finding a group to become your social foundation, if you would, your social pillar, has become incredibly difficult. In Japanese society, what happened is companies replaced a lot of that, or tried to. And from the 60s through the 90s, that actually sort of worked. So you became loyal to Sony or Matsushita or whoever, and that sort of became your neighborhood. That worked for the husband, but of course it didn't work as well for the wife, because she obviously didn't work for the company, or if she did, it was temporary part-time. So she was still left sort of adrift. After the 1999-2001 financial collapse in Japan, and then that's been several times they've had reoccurring financial problems. Japanese companies have downsized to a staggering extent. So the salaryman today of 2026, 2027 bears no relationship to his dad's counterparts, say 20, 30 years ago, both in numbers and also for what you might call sort of the quality of life setting in the office. So in some ways, Japanese office jobs have become much more close to their European/American counterparts. And what this means is even more so, families have been sort of put adrift in terms of, who's their social net, who do they hang out with, who do they call if they have a problem? Because you have to remember, in Asian societies, you don't talk to outsiders. It would never occur to anyone in Asian society to talk to a suicide counselor, for example, like the suicide counseling program we have at Chaminade. It would never occur to anyone at a university or in a home situation or anything like that to call up a stranger and say, "Hey, I'm having problems. Can I get some help?" It's none of anyone's business, and the last thing you want to do is share family problems with an anonymous stranger. That's just not going to happen anywhere in Asia. In fact, I'd be willing to bet there's probably more suicide counseling that goes on in Hawaii on a weekly, monthly basis than there is in all of Japan, which is a huge country, in terms of population. It's just not something that people would think of. And so there's no idea of specialist professional support for folks, even in school settings. So it makes life, families and life in general become very vulnerable and fragile, I would argue, in modern Japan. The family is seen as an economic unit. This is true in all of Asia. Again, family is different. In China, the family would be, some subgroup or a group of the clan. In Korean society, sort of similar, certainly the extended family. In Japanese society, it would be, yeah, now that's one of the classic problems. Traditionally, that would have been it would have been a family, but within a supportive neighborhood. Now, yeah, now it is what it is. It's not, folks have no guideline for how to deal with change because Japanese society hasn't changed in probably 1,500, 2,000 years. I mean, you think of how much trouble Americans are having with change, and they've only have to deal with social instability in maybe 30 or 40 years. So you can imagine if you have sort of 1,500 years of, yeah, I suppose you wouldn't call it fossilization, but sort of this is the way it's done. Change is not an option. The Koseki register is an interesting part of this. The Koseki register is something that I think starts up in the Ashikaga shogunate, so about 1300s. And this was a way that the existing shogunate government, and we're not talking imperial family. Imperial family is a decorative piece in Kyoto. But this is the actual ruling government of Japan. They wanted to, and they felt they had to keep track of just exactly what everyone was up to, especially commoners, i.e. the slash, peasants, servants, the bei, the folks without a last name. And so what they do is they set up this idea of a register or a registry. This is modern Chinese have the same thing. This is Chinese society in 2026. But Koseki Bridge starts up then. When the Tokugawas come to power in 1600, given their sort of collective social paranoia and worrying about keeping control, they amped this. So everyone was put on a Koseki register. I suppose the difference with the Chinese system is you didn't carry any documents around with you. So if you remember, there was that image I showed you of the shogunate office in Takayama, where the guys that managed the town or village would be. They would keep the register. So the central authorities would have a register of everyone who lived in Takayama, the grades they had in school, all the same stuff the Chinese do, and everything that's ever happened to that family, and that's in the Koseki registry. Those were persistent when Japan becomes the Meiji, when Japan joins the quote modern world in the late 19th century. That became even more so because in part the Japanese militaristic state of the late 19th, mid 20th century was based in sort of imperial Germany, and then what later becomes Nazi Germany. And Germans have always been really heavy on social, governmental, political control. So the Japanese just sort of expanded to this logic. So everything in terms of who you could marry, and obviously where you could live, the job you could have, and all that was in the Koseki registry. And what would happen is in Japanese society from say like 15 or 1400 on to 1945, is if a guy and a lady started to date and there was a potential they might want to get married, both of their families would then go to the local district office, which was usually the police. But the police officers were this generally had this, at least in the historic period. And they would go there and they'd check the register. Now, what they would go to the registry is make sure that the family had had a good rep, I guess, for latter term. Again, you have to remember in Asian societies, there's a very strong sense of sociobiology. Asian societies were, and still are, it hasn't changed at all, are firmly convinced that a lot of what you are, especially behaviorally, but especially in potential, is based, you inherit that. So, in America's side, we have this, you're artistic because you picked that up from your mom's side of the family. There's an assumption of that, and I think Americans actually believe it pretty strongly, but it's not actually formally in the system. There's this idea of nurture, for example, and that you grow up with it, so you can train someone to be artistic. In Asian societies, that would not be the case. Asian societies have always and still are totally fixed on the idea that you inherit abilities. You also inherit potential for behavior. So, if you have a bad temper, that's going to be inherited from one side of the family or the other. How you manifest it is going to be you. But the fact that you're prone to having a bad temper or you really have to control it would be an inheritance. So in that situation, that's one of the main reasons to look at the Koseki. The Koseki would tell you, this potential spouse's family has a history of da 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 da, or they don't do da 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 da. And that would give you an idea whether it's going to be a good marriage. Because you have to remember, as in the rest of Asia, you marry for life. Divorce is not an option. And to be honest, it really still isn't. Japanese side people do divorce, but there's a whole sort of social stigmas and questions attached to that. It's not something you do casually. Um, so the Koseki was really important. Now, interesting enough, what happens is post 1945, when the American occupation comes in, they make this illegal because that's part of what they see as this police state. So they actually, well, and a lot of the registries have been destroyed. The urban ones are all burned down when the cities got burned down in the late part of World War II. And so most folks don't have it. For especially middle upper class or upperly mobile Japanese from the 1960s, 70s on, they really want to have they want to have a modern version of the registry. And so what happens is you find that this becomes one of the huge growth industries in Japan from the 60s on is private detective companies. And one of the main things they do, in fact, still do in Japan, is they investigate a potential spouse's family, and basically do the equivalent of what would be a koseki. Here's all the family members. This is what their history is, and da 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 da. So it moved from a formal government registry to an informal one. And I think there's actually two. There were. I'm not sure how many there are now. But by the 1990s, especially with the growth of the internet, what you got was actually companies setting themselves up as sort of like potential marriage slash spouse databases. So not the same as a matchmaker type thing, but basically a system of checks and balances, for families. So if you bump into a member of the Yoshida family, the first thing you would do is contact one of these companies, go on there, pay their fee, and they'll go to the database and type up everything on the Yoshida family outside of, this part of Kobe. And you get all the dirt and all the good and the bad about every member of the family that they can manage to collate. This has been a big growth industry too. I'm not sure. I've not seen any numbers on that, but I'm not sure you would because I'm pretty sure that's proprietary information. Key thing with this, and I can't emphasize this too much, is you don't have the emotional, practical links to clan or extended family that you do in Chinese and Korean societies. And I think that makes the Japanese family a lot less durable. In China, as I think I mentioned in the last part, what you have is Chinese, a lot of Chinese in rural areas moved to the city. In the last 4 to 5 years, a lot of those Chinese then moved back to the family in the rural areas. They very frequently would send the kids back to the family, and that's because you have these clan ties. You're not putting an onus on your relatives to send them your kids. It's an expected part of the family network, and the people accept it, and I think actually sort of enjoy it because it makes them feel needed and valuable. Japanese can't do that. If you suddenly call up your uncle and say, "Oh, I want to send my 7-year-old kid out to you because we're moving to Nagoya," I have no idea what your uncle would say. I mean, Japanese being Japanese, they're not going to say anything. But the fact that they don't say anything is basically like, forget it. So you don't have a large support network. And of course, that would be the downside of neighborhoods. Neighbors aren't going to take care of your kids. Neighbors can't take care of your relatives to a certain extent, unless they're really, really close. Neighbors aren't going to take care of your old family members. That's a family's responsibility. And that goes back to if you ever want to do a Google search of AKIYA, AKIYA, and that's why I have so many abandoned homes. Is old folks have nowhere to go and no one to depend on in many cases, unlike their Chinese and Korean counterparts, where they hypothetically they do at least. Japan they don't, and that's the Japanese inability to deal with the changes of the 20th, 21st century. There's a real typical thing that you find in Japan that starts up. I'm sure it existed before. In fact, as I seem to remember, some of the samurai families actually practiced this a lot to build loyalty with the sort of non-formal family members that were, you expected to defend the family or defend the property or whatever. But certainly post 1960s, as as in Asian, most, and as in all Asian societies, most industry, most businesses are family owned. But you can imagine the problem you get into if you don't have any sons. Now, in Chinese society, what will happen is you usually bring in a male relative, maybe a cousin or something like that from the same generation in to do it. So you try to keep it within the clan, if you would. In Japanese society, you don't have that same option, never have. And so what happens is you're going to actually bring in someone who isn't kin. What happens is the deal that you make with them and their family is that when you bring them in, they're going to take over your family name. And so at that point, they now become the new sort of de facto son of the family, and that's very intentional for them to take over the family business. And in doing so, that's the trade. They have to give up their family of birth, which, given the patriarchal logic of Japanese society, is hard for people to do. There's a lot of social stigma attached to that. But they become new fictive kin, head of the family of adoption. So, for example, if your last name is Toyota, which is traditionally the family that owns and runs Toyota Motor Company, and so you've run out of Toyotas, what you do is you bring in someone else. But it's very possible that what would happen is that person then would come in, they'd marry one of your daughters in the Toyota family, and they would then take the Toyota last name. But everyone's very aware from the get-go. The main reason they moved into the family and became a part of the family was to become the head of the family. So it's a very, I suppose maybe Americans would see it sort of callous, but you have to remember that the Asian view of marriage is a contractual relationship between families. It's not based on the idea of love, or as the Japanese would call them, miai matches, which the Japanese, as with the rest of Asia, treat very suspiciously because they see that as being a temporary affectation versus a realistic long-term goal. So importing sons-in-law is actually, the idea of fictive kin is actually really, really pretty common, especially nowadays in Japan, given the low birth rate. So it's not uncommon to bump into someone who has a last name, but that's actually not a genealogical last name. It's an adopted last name. And you sometimes can see that in the way that they're treated by the folks around them that know the history of what's going on. So what you find here is status tends to be based on relationships. And again, I mentioned this, I think, earlier, is in Japan, there's no two people that have the same social position. Everyone is somewhat higher or somewhat lower than the folks around them. Now, this would even go back to the image of the kids I showed you in Takayama. All those kids, even though they're just neighbors, there's a social pecking order in that class. It might be based on the order of the parents. It might be based on how long the family's been in Takayama. Who knows? It's going to vary from place to place, group to group. But within that class of kids, when you listen to them talking to each other, when you watch them interact, you're going to realize there's a social hierarchy. It might be based in gender, probably most of it will, but not necessarily. Some of the girls in that class, I don't know, those kids, maybe 10 years old, something like that, might be of higher social status than their male counterparts. But it's going to be relational. Now, what that means, of course, is those kids are fine as long as they're interacting with each other. But if you suddenly take that kid and then move them to a new neighborhood, to a new school, and we'll say all the other kids in that school are also new to the school, then imagine the trouble those kids are going to have because they've never been in a situation where they have to figure out what strangers are. Maybe one stranger, yeah, you plug one stranger into a standard setting, then when the dust settles, it's like the new kid in the class. But in this situation, maybe you've got a bunch of new kids in the class. Well, then how do they sort this out? And Japanese society, as typical with, in other Asian societies, of course, they would sort it out by virtue of clan hierarchy. But in Japanese society, it's again one of these huge other stumbling blocks they have is kin position does not define who you are, which is why they have so much trouble compared to Asians, to Chinese and Koreans. Let's stop there.